All right, all right. This is the first live edition of the Public Works podcast. I'm here with Shane Silsby, my normal road dog here. We'll talk about some of the stuff we have coming up together, and also some of the things that are going on with our businesses in the space. But first of all, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you like the look, like the vibe. Shane was out in Arizona. He was presenting to our Arizona chapter of the APWA chapter. Did a great presentation. It's kind of truncated. I don't think we gave him enough time, but he did great with it. So Shane, tell us what you've been up to for the last Q4, then what you have on the boiler coming up soon.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. As always, great job supporting the public works industry with the Public Works podcast. We appreciate that. Glad I get to meet you. Well, not meet you, but participate with you in person today. So that's awesome. Really what has been going on the last quarter, it was trying to help in my focus with local governments, cities and counties across the country, is to help them kind of get through the end of that calendar year with some initiatives, things that a calendar year kind of deadline or prepping for the next calendar year. Mm-hmm. And then now what's happening kind of in the first quarter here as we head into the second quarter is local governments getting ready for their budgetary development of their fiscal year budgets, which most of those start on July 1st. So by about March, you want to have all your budgetary information in. Every department submits their requests, and then that gets put into kind of a mixing pot, and then you figure out priorities, what you can afford for every agency. So what I'm helping those local governments do now is establish some critical strategic initiatives that need to have funding requested, right? If you request funding in July, you're gonna have to wait a whole cycle to get your initiative funded.
Yep.
So it needs to get ready now and then be sent in by March, basically, and then go through the process.
Gotcha.
Part of that is capital improvement programming. That's a big thing because that needs to get all established for all the capital projects, roads, water, energy, whatever it is, into that system. So that's one of the big things going on. And then higher level, trying to help with federal advocacy, with infrastructure funding. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit, but what's going on in DC, how do I help people back here in the Southwest, and then some other elements. But I'm going to kick it back to you to see what you're up to, and maybe we can also talk about some of the conferences we've been selected to present at and what that might look like.
Yeah. Well, the date for, if you don't know, I mean, it's end of February. And like you said, there's a lot of those budgetary proposals. You pitch your service to somebody and they say, well, we like it, give us a number so they can put it in their budget to be able to go and get the funds for it. So I've been doing a lot of that. I would say the conference circuit has been quiet for November, December into January, and now it's starting to pick back up. So I have already speaking engagements on the calendar coming up soon. But recently, there's been a couple things that have worked for me in regards to, I would say, getting more people to understand what Vitendo is and does. I've already kind of been able to get across like the whole succession planning, the tribal knowledge, the institutionalized knowledge, and why they should get that captured to be able to use it to hire somebody new. But I would say that everybody's talking about AI, right? AI is this hot button issue. And I said, how can I use AI to supplement what I do, or to make it a add-on or another piece of value with Vitendo? And I thought about it, and I said, well, the same person that gets hired for an agency, they have to operate, a pump or a lift station or a truck or, whatever they're doing in their process. Wouldn't it be cool if they had in their pocket, kind of like a Chat GPT, but specific for that industry? And so that's what I did. Is I spent, I probably spent 2 hours a week for the last so many weeks and trained an AI chatbot on all the things that we do in the industry. So as of now, like, I've been testing it with different people around the country, and I'd always say, hey, if you can stump it, try to stump it. And they ask it 3 questions, and like, I can literally see how many people are interacting with it. And daily, like, it's crazy, daily people are asking it questions of like math. Like, I wasn't the best person in math, so sometimes if I'm need to do some quick head math, I'll pull out a calculator. but there's formulas in these industries that like they have to get done right. And when somebody could type in what's the formula for this or what's the math equation for that, they can find the answer for it. So this AI chatbot has been something that I added on with Vitendo, all the video content, all the how-to content, to where they can get those simple questions answered.
And this is probably eventually going to tie into your standards and documents database that you've been working on to try to help your customers in the industry as well.
Yeah, it's like when I just did a project for the city of Columbus, Ohio, right? And we did probably 80 something pieces of content over a week, which is pretty good. And wouldn't it be cool if, there is a chat bot on the front of the page of the, the software that they're working with or whatever software they have, and an operator says, "Hey, I'm going to use a plow truck. What should be the salt brine mix for X, Y, and Z, or for this type of application?" If they can type that into the chat bot, it can give them an answer, a PDF of like what the mix could be, but also the videos that are attached to how to operate the truck, how to make sure your mix is right, how to apply what speed you should be driving at. So all those things can be attached to the chatbot, which I think is pretty cool. I've already told others about it, and I haven't launched it yet, but this is something that will be added on to Vitendo in the future.
That's great. It's awesome. I'm sure your folks will be happy to experience that, and then of course everybody going forward.
Yeah,
it's pretty topical with what we've seen. Not trying to be political. I live in purple areas, if you will, blue and red across the country where I've been, but it's news and what's happening kind of at the federal level with, trying to, or not trying to, but basically laying off 200,000 federal employees or whatever the number ends up being. And that to me should be a high level indication of thinking about preparedness, right? My book's Managing for Meteors, How to Get Prepared for Disruptors. Well, this is obviously a major disruptor. Your efforts about what happens when the person most knowledgeable leaves
every time,
and those left behind could take advantage of what you're trying to assist with. Yeah.
And we'll definitely dive into, some of your thoughts on Doge and all the government. I would say looking behind the covers, looking behind the curtains of what's going on and how that can affect the local government. But I did want to address that you and I were selected to speak at Arizona Snow and Ice, APWA Snow and Ice in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think you're familiar with that place, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going up to Grand Rapids. We're doing a presentation. It's going to be great. If you're watching, stay tuned. We're going to get you tuned in to where you can ask questions. You can interact with us while we're there. And then also our abstract got accepted for PWX in Chicago. So I'm excited for that. It's always good hopping on the stage with you and doing the song and dance.
Yeah, I know in Chicago, I believe we're going to try to look at a LinkedIn Live event, right? And use that as the session and give people an opportunity who might not have been on a podcast before or a live event, social event to participate in that, live studio audience, if you will, for some folks, first timers there.
Yeah. So how's the book going, man? You wrote the book, Managing for Meteors. I read it, solid, but it's one thing to write a book. It's another thing to get it out to the masses.
Yeah, that part is, challenging. I'm not a big marketer or whatever. It's a niche book about, local governments and how they can become more effective and efficient. And although I have had a lot of people in the private sector say, well, these organizational dynamics are translatable. Some of the things we're talking about, doesn't matter if it's government or not, which is true. And this concept of preparedness, right? Getting prepared to the extent you can. And being strategic about what you do in case these meteors come at you, like wholesale change at the federal government, or funding initiative locally doesn't go through, or you have a local election where things change. So that part has been good. Having the audio book available, I think, is good for commuters.
Oh, you have it out now, the audio book?
It's audio, yes.
Okay. Are you narrating it? Is that you?
I am not narrating it. No, I selected the narrator. I should have come to you for that, but I missed that. So you can listen at your leisure to the chapters, which I think is helpful for people with a long commute. And of course, there's a digital copy people can look at on their devices too. So it's been interesting because obviously we have businesses. We're trying to do things in the industry to make a difference, and then that's just one more thing.
100%. Kind of switching subjects. So I had on interviewee on my podcast. He worked for the federal government. When the administration changes, most they get the boot. They have to go. Their time there is done. And I asked him, like, kind of tongue in cheek with what I do selfishly. I said, so is there like a sticky note that you leave on the desk and say, hey, here's what I do for this situation, here's what I do for that? Like, is there some type of handoff, that happens when that administration's employees leave the federal government to the next? And he said no. He said no. He said when he got into it, he was kind of just, starting fresh and figuring things out. One of the bigger topics on the news, well, I think on the federal side is Elon Musk, Doge. They're looking into government inefficiencies. They're peeling back the the layers of the onion to see where money should be cut from. And I don't think anybody could be mad at that, but that can change the way people operate. It can shake things up. How do you think that will start to impact on the local government side? And then what should they be looking into to say, hey, like, we're fine or we're doing good things?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and it's really, in my lifetime, the biggest disruption that's ever occurred at the federal level from operational standpoint. So as your guest talked about before from the federal government side, appointed positions, they change over when a presidential administration changes over. And sometimes it doesn't even matter, Democrat, Republican, it's just a new administration has their own people.
Yep.
And the sticky note item is interesting because you would think that would be helpful, but in some cases, the next administration doesn't care what those people did, right?
Yeah.
Even if they did it right. So that is very common that the appointed leaders turn over. What is different in this case is the appointed people turn over, but usually there's the civil servants, there's the structure of the agencies that maintain continuity.
Sure.
And then, priorities are shifted or whatever the case might be by the new appointed leaders. But you have the machine still able to move.
Yep.
In this case, the machine has been broken on purpose. And so that creates a lot of challenges, obviously. And when you do any initiative, and I'm all about government efficiency and effectiveness, and we talk about that in my book too, so I'm all for that. Mm-hmm. But there are some components, right? There's the why, the what, and the how, which have not been described at all
Right.
with the federal initiatives, right? So we don't really know the why. We guess what the why is, maybe to reduce federal expenditures, but the downstream impacts have not been thought out strategically about what happens. So for our clients, cities and counties, local governments, a lot of the ones that I work with have had to go heads down to figure out, are they going to be able to pay their bills for certain programs that have a federal nexus?
Yeah.
Or if they had a grant project, what's going to happen there? There's been funding clawbacks, freeze on funding, cancellation of grant programs. All those things negatively impact the local government agencies.
Yeah.
So any positive spin out of this years from now where federal government taxation has been reduced, the local governments are going to be negatively impacted during that entire time because what happens is, and just to use California as an example, California sends, it's a donor state. So when you look at taxation across the country, California sends, I think the last statistic I heard, but you can check it, about $83.5 billion more to the federal government than they receive in benefits from the federal government.
Interesting.
Whereas other states, usually the middle of the country, they receive much more than they give because populations, businesses and that tax, and then people's income tax. There's more people on the coast, and California is the largest, most populous state. So now the question is, if those tax dollars are not coming back to your community, should you send them in the first place, right? Which is a really difficult equation because the role of government is to do for people what they can't do for themselves. That's the definition. Do for people what they can't do for themselves. And when you look at local, state, federal, at each level, there are sometimes things that that level can do that other levels can't.
Yep.
Think about national defense, for example, NASA or whatever.
Yep.
Right? A local government city is not going to do that.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge with all of those elements, is by breaking the machine, and not having a plan for how it gets rebuilt, or people not understanding the end goal of this thing to be able to prepare or adapt, then you're just left with confusion. And in any government setting, you want people aligned to maximize what you're paying people to do or projects. And that confusion creates inefficiencies all across the spectrum.
I'd agree with that. One thing that we see a lot is tariffs. I talked to a guy, he has a company in Canada. He sells software to municipalities. And I asked him, I said, well, you hear of all this, Trump's talking about tariffs and tariffs from Canada, tariffs, Mexico, tariffs, tariffs out the yin yang. And I asked him if he was worried about it. And he says, of course, he keeps his ear open for it and what it should look like. I mean, I can personally think back to, 2019, 2020, we had, the shipments, I guess, through the ports weren't coming because of COVID and supply chain issues and things like that. And if I couldn't get a PTO for a truck, I couldn't put my body on it to give it to the customer. And so we had a lead time of 10 months, and that 10 months turned in about 2 years. And it's unfortunate. You got to go back to let's say a water operations supervisor and say, hey, you thought you're going to get your truck in July. It's not going to be here until next August. So what do you think of the tariffs that are stated, or what they can look like and how it can affect local government?
Yeah, local government is going to be directly impact on the project side, capital delivery side. So if you're building a new fire station, that fire station needs steel, it needs electrical components, needs safety equipment. Much of that is produced outside of the country. So you apply a tariff to that. You can still acquire that specialized piece of equipment, but now you're going to pay the 25% or whatever it is that the administration decides on for a tariff, and that's going to be paid by your local government. So this idea, and I think we've talked about tariffs a little bit before, but this idea that you're going to somehow penalize countries that are not from the U.S., that are importing to the U.S., and you're going to generate revenue for the government, the federal government. Two elements. First, you're not penalizing the suppliers because people in America are still buying. So that's still happening.
I have to.
And as we say, in a capital project for a city or a county, they need that equipment to make it safe or meet their standards or specifications. So that's got to happen anyway. So there's a fallacy there. And then the second piece of it is, you might be on paper generating additional revenue into the federal government through the tariff, but it's the local governments that are paying it, and the communities in those cities and counties that pay into the local government to deliver that project. So the burden is being levied against the American people, and that is the challenge with it. So if you have tariffs in place, that's creating a burden on the American people that they didn't have before, and they're not getting their federal tax dollars back to them in the form of infrastructure because of all the freezes and diversions that have been happening since the administration took over. Then you look at what's the positive? Where's the why in all of this stuff? And that, I think, is a big failure. Not trying to figure out what that is, so that everybody kind of understands what the game plan is.
The idea of, and I've been a year before, the value added tax. Instead of paying the federal income tax, they go to let's say flat tax, whatever. But the value added tax was thrown around. What are your thoughts on that? How will these entities get their money if this tax is taken away?
Excuse me. It's remains to be seen, right? Because when you're levying a tax as any level, local, state, or federal government, that is generally to pay for a specific initiative or function or whatever the case is. Usually a specific tax is linked to a semi-specific need. The general taxes we pay are going to a general fund, and those are used for many purposes. But anything that's specific is supposed to be tied to some end goal. That's why that tax was invented or levied or a fee created. So I think the future remains to be seen on what you're talking about, because if people don't understand the outcomes, they're not going to be happy with the application of that.
The IIJA, the Infrastructure Jobs Act, the amount of money that was given out. How are we on that? Like, we're February, has it all been divvied out? Like, should people still be applying for it? What's the status on it?
That's a good question. Investment Infrastructure Jobs Act, we call the IIJA, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We were in year 4, effectively, with one more year to go this October. And so formulaic allocations based on population of states had been sent out for year 4. There is uncertainty about clawbacks for that, and a clawback is you receive the money for the federal government, and the federal government comes in and claws it back.
Oh, wow. That's a thing?
That's a thing. And so there's concern about that. It's already happened in some grant programs. So that is 60% of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The 40% on grants, we've seen changes to the grant merit criteria. The RAISE grant was a popular program. Notice the funding opportunity got changed the weekend before it was due, on the Thursday that the grant was due. And I was helping some of my clients, and that was a challenge because, you work on something for 3 months, and then you change the rules with 4 days to go. That's a problem. Other grant programs that are popular and help Republicans and Democrats across the country were canceled. And so that's a challenge. And what we will see or try to find out more about, and I'll be headed to DC on behalf of American Public Works Association and American Society of Civil Engineers in March and April, is we're going to be advocating to Congress for infrastructure funding to say, look, this bipartisan infrastructure law was a bipartisan effort approved by Democrats and Republicans, authorized by Congress, funding approved, programs approved, and now the new administration is stopping that. So Congress, what are you going to do? You're supposed to be the check and balance. And so we are going to be advocating with Congress to be the check and balance and step up and return the flow of infrastructure funding to the states and grant applicants as was originally promised.
Wasn't it stopped, or weren't the grants, everything frozen or something, like as soon as the administration changed?
The early days said that they would put a 90-day pause on it, but things have not necessarily gotten better in the actions that have been taken during the pause. There have been cancellations, deferrals, things like that. So some funding was returned for contracts already issued or programs that were already approved. But the challenge, people don't always think about this, the bipartisan infrastructure law was the largest investment in the history of the country into infrastructure since the big New Deal with FDR. So that's a big thing. And you think about trying to align all of your cities and counties across the country to take advantage of that and improve their communities, which is what it's all about. And then to stop it, governments are not built to be quick reaction. They're not military organizations. They just are trying to do the best they can. And if you change the rules, they never want to do anything wrong, of course. So then they have to reassess what that is. And a lot of times that means stopping because of a risk at the local level. So it has a cascading effect.
Gotcha. You spoke earlier about, I forgot what you had said, but there was a bill or law that came out, or secretary, or
there was a memo, right?
Okay.
So by the new transportation secretary that was issued to potentially give guidance to how federal funding would be allocated in the future. And it's very interesting. I mean, you can look it up. I can read it to you. But the crib notes of that, the cliff notes, are that it is asking for federal funding to be assigned in a different way. And the merit criteria, if you will, or the target criteria listed in this memo by the transportation secretary were areas that had higher birth rates, areas that had higher percentage of married residents or citizenships. So those are the two kind of demographic ones.
Interesting.
And then the other were not allowing federal funding to flow effectively to agencies if they had a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion policies, or if they required vaccines or masks, they shouldn't get federal funding. which quick asterisk on that, it's obviously linked to the pandemic we know about, but it doesn't consider a future pandemic that we don't know about with the impacts of that, which is a problem. And then finally, it has language in there about cooperating with authorities on deportation, immigration issues in the community. So it puts strings on it for areas that, or cities and counties that may have had things to try to be a little bit more progressive. So it penalizes that. And then it also, when you look at the maps, and there are a couple of industry agencies, nonpartisan agencies, that did some analysis on the remapping of those change in merit criteria for demographics. So let's say you look at marriage and basically birth rates. Two maps that I saw, one was of Chicago and one was of Atlanta. And in metro areas, most of the people live in the cities, right?
Correct.
The further out you get, the less people there are. Well, when you look at the remapping, what it does effectively, when you look at higher marriage rates and birth rates, it moves the funding outside of the metro areas.
I would think,
So not 100%, but
the suburbs
most of the
are
funding.
Mostly families and children.
Right.
Cities, singles and no children. Yeah.
Which is interesting because that now positions funding to be spent where fewer people live.
Correct. Less density,
And the prior administration was a little bit more focused on spending money where more people are. And the interesting thing, which again has not been considered strategically by the new administration, is more people are there because of the infrastructure that's in place there. Think about transit, your ports, your street systems, all of that, your utility systems, your Wi-Fi, broadband, all of that. And that's generally where the employment centers are, and the retail centers and the entertainment centers, right?
Big
high rise.
Yeah.
So if all that is in the areas that are more metro, why wouldn't you spend money in those areas? Now, we know the politics of it, and that rural areas, right, tend to devote more for the new administration. But the prior administration, in the grant notices of funding opportunity, there was a split. So there was money assigned to rural areas. So it wasn't all going to urban areas anyway.
I think most would think that, like, oh, you think of Chicago, think of Atlanta. Well, they have a ton of money. They have the bigger budgets. But, you look at some of the infrastructure, the homeless, just graffiti, it looks a lot different than the suburbs. So how do they counter that where somebody says, well, they already had the money and didn't do well with it?
It's a good question, and it gets back to government efficiency then at the local level. But they collect more money locally, but they also have greater expenditures.
Yeah.
Right. So think about a suburban city outside of Chicago. They probably don't have tourists. They don't have a job center to the same extent. They don't have the traffic to the same extent. So their expenses are way up. And rarely in governments do they have enough money. Governments are nonprofit.
Yeah.
Rarely do they have enough money to cover all of their needs.
Yeah.
Because other things happen, right? Tourists go there, right? Trucks go through there to ship things, whatever it is, and they don't collect at the same rate for those uses.
Yeah. That kind of leads me into one of the final questions. You talked in your presentation about tribalism. With the last 3 presidential races, you see people picking a side. That you see them walk into a room and find their people and only want to commune with their people. They don't want to talk to the other side. You've worked for a big agency. How do you kind of keep that outside of your agency and not letting it fester? Like if you walk into your cafeteria, you got the right wing people here, you got the left wing people here. Like how do you make sure everybody's playing nice in the sandbox?
Yeah, good question. And tribalism is an organizational dynamic term for people that kind of find their tribe, if you will, in an organization or workplace. So any initiative that you're trying to do in your government agency or even your private entity, if it counters that tribalism, what that group believes or thinks is important, that's when you get problems, pushback, cultural issues, morale issues. So what I always encourage people to do is, again, like I talked about earlier, starting with, why are you doing this? What are you going to do to make it happen? How are you going to do it? What is the end game? What's in it for that group potentially, if there is anything, but just being very transparent about what's going on, and then trying to get people aligned. And if you can get alignment, you can break through some of the tribalism and then get to a state of collective effervescence, which is what I talked about a little bit, which is where you
big words, man.
Yeah, I know. And getting people all pointing in the right direction, and it gets a momentum that is greater than just the people working on it.
Yeah.
Right. And when that happens, that can counter tribalism, because now you have a bigger tribe, if you will, or a bigger group, all head in the same direction. And then the people left behind feel like they don't want to be left behind.
Yeah. Okay. What did we miss? Anything we didn't talk about today?
I think we hit most of it. One of the things that I've been working on, and that probably is going to impact you, I think, is just, we talked about the elections at the national level a little bit, and those impacts and what's happening. But part of what I deal with is election impacts at the local level.
Okay.
And so if you're working for a city or county or whatever the case may be, and then there's a changeover in the elected officials, that can then talk about a disruption that can then cascade and have an impact on, like, the city manager.
Yeah.
If that person gets, removed, then it has an impact on the directors, and then those people can get moved out. So part of what's been happening in early 2025 is adapting to what's happened with local elections, whether it's a change in the staff or the leaders or a change in policy, and then trying to redirect and figure out how to help people under those new kind of parameters.
If you're on the outside looking in, like, let's say you're a street supervisor and you're not really in an elected position, what should you be looking for within your own agency to know that there's not a meteor coming, or if there is a meteor coming?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is, and we're talking about preparedness here. And preparedness, if you're trying to be the most effective and efficient you can be, the disruptor, the type of disruptor almost doesn't matter, right? The magnitude will matter, but the type, it will put pressure on you. And if you've done the things you need to do, then you'll be able to withstand it better than if you didn't get prepared. So for somebody that's maybe a line level or supervisor level, there's a couple things. One is to make sure you participate in any feedback opportunities to let the leadership know your thoughts on it or your concerns or whatever the case may be, or what you want to see. And then secondly, like we talked about today in the session, is if you're in a room and you're looking for leadership and nobody is stepping up, people might be counting on you to be the leader. So, if you have enough experience and, maybe an education or training to understand how to put a strategy together, the reason why you might not be seeing it is people might be looking to you to provide that. So leadership can happen at any level to try to get you more prepared to deal with those eventual meteors.
Sure. You said you're going to Capitol Hill soon to advocate for agencies, public works. What would you say is your marching orders or something you're focused on, or the flag you're flying to Capitol Hill?
Yeah, a couple things. One is for my role through like ASCE, and then more generally what I'll be doing for my clients is trying to, as we talked about earlier, push Congress or advocate and provide stories to Congress about why it's important to get that infrastructure funding restarted.
Yeah.
And what are the negative impacts? So I always advise people, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or send a note to Joe on telling your story, and which brings me over to the APWA side, American Public Works Association, which does have a Tell Your Story portal. So you can give it to me and I'll use it to advocate, or you can give it directly to APWA. But when we switch over to the APWA side, the second part of my trip will be to do that same thing with Congress, but then also advocate for APWA's policy priorities for the 119th Congress, which is the Congress that just started in January, about transportation, water, and emergency management. The transportation policy priority that I helped write has elements in there about funding and streamlining and things like that. And what's happening is a freeze on funding, which is obviously not streamlining. And so we'll be advocating along that path.
Okay. Well, good stuff. Speaking of advocating, it's one of the main reasons why I started this podcast. When I first got in the industry, there was nothing like it to where I could hear the stories, the anecdotes, the nomenclature, the verbiage terms, like all the different things in the industry. So that's why I started this. And it's always fun sitting down with you to hear more. I feel like whenever you start talking government and federal, like it's tough to keep up with, but it's good food for us to have, because these are things that we need to know. And it usually mostly trickles down to the state level or to the local level. So
for sure. And I think on that point, as we wrap up, is that anybody can advocate. There's not a limitation. Most people, they end their advocacy efforts with their vote in a presidential election.
That's a good point.
That's what I did. I made my mind known.
Yeah.
Yep. But that only puts the people in place. Then those priorities you need to advocate for what those people now should be working on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they might have a platform, but it might not be aligned with your platform.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean either side is right. It just means that we need to figure out what's the most appropriate thing for either party. And if you're advocating for local government, you might vote personally, but in your workplace, you need to advocate for what's best for your community.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And you can do that any number of ways through organizations like we work with, trade organizations. You can call your congressional member.
Yeah.
You can just go to a website and type in to find your legislator, and you can find out your legislator. Send them an email. They almost always respond. At least when I send notes in, they respond. So I encourage everybody to advocate, tell your story, how it impacts you positively or negatively. And don't think that because of you're just one person or you're at a certain level that you can't do that. Yeah. Everybody's voice matters.
Sure. So how can people find more about you, and then what should they be calling you for?
Yeah. And thanks, Joe. They can find me on LinkedIn through Shane Silsby. They can go to the website, silsby-sa.com. They can go and find out more about my book, managingformeteors.com. Any number of ways. And I appreciate you having me on again. And thanks for all of your advocacy efforts for the Public Works podcast. And you probably should tell them how they can get a hold of you and find out about all your stuff and track our future presentation.
The normal way is I'm most active on LinkedIn. So Joseph Blackman on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about Vitendo, go to vitendo.us. Again, succession planning, the silver tsunami. My main focus is getting knowledge from the people who have it to the people who want it, or the people who want it. And that's one of my main passions in life, through using video. So reach out to me. We'll talk more about it. This has been a special edition of the Public Works Podcast. If you guys like the format, give me a thumbs up in the comments. Hopefully we don't have to do this every time, but it's a good vibe being face-to-face and in person. So thanks for tuning in. This has been a special edition of the Public Works Podcast.
Thanks, Joe.
Yep.